Thanks for meeting with us again. We started drafting our regulatory strategy and had a few more questions. Our device has two components, the knee implant and the associated AI software. Do you think we should seek clearance for these together under code QPP, or is it better to submit them separately?
Deciding whether to submit them together or separately depends on several factors. Submitting together could streamline your process since the FDA would review both components simultaneously. It often results in clearer communication and a more integrated evaluation. What are your thoughts on handling the documentation for both at once?
I see the advantage in efficiency, but I'm concerned about the complexity of the combined documentation. Could that slow us down if issues arise with one component?
That's a valid concern. A combined submission does require more extensive documentation, especially on how the components interact. Any issues with one part could indeed delay the entire device's approval. On the flip side, submitting them separately might help isolate the review processes. Each component would be evaluated on its own merits, which could simplify documentation. How critical is the time to market for each component in your strategy?
Time to market is pretty crucial for us, especially for the software component. It sounds like separating the submissions could mitigate some risk. Is there a downside to that approach?
Separating them does have drawbacks, primarily the increased complexity in managing multiple submissions. Each component would undergo its own review cycle, potentially doubling your workload and time. Plus, you would still need to include how the components interact with regard to safety and effectiveness, so that the FDA can evaluate how they interact.
I hadn't considered the impact of not evaluating the interactions. That could certainly impact our decision.
Yes, and that's why these decisions depend so much on your specific situation. I recommend considering all these factors and possibly engaging with the FDA early through the pre-submission process. It can provide valuable guidance on which approach suits your device best. What's your next step in the decision-making process?
Based on our discussion, I think we should evaluate our bandwidth for completing the documentation and perhaps start with some early discussions with the FDA. Thanks, Colleen. This has been incredibly helpful for framing our strategy.
You're welcome.
I've been trying to understand the terms software as a medical device, SaMD, and software in a medical device, SIMD. Can you explain the difference in which category our project falls into?
Absolutely. These terms are essential for classifying software in the medical field. SaMD is software that functions as a medical device on its own. It doesn't need to be part of any hardware medical device to serve its intended medical purpose. Examples include mobile health apps, software that analyzes medical images, or any standalone software used for diagnosing or treating conditions.
So it operates independently. That makes sense. What about SIMD?
While SaMD operates independently, SIMD is software that must be integrated within a hardware medical device to work. It's crucial for the medical device to fulfill its intended purpose. For instance, the software in a cardiac pacemaker or the control system for an MRI machine falls under this category.
I see. So the software is essentially a component that helps the hardware function correctly.
Exactly. SIMD cannot function as intended without the hardware, and it is integral to the implant's operation and medical purpose. It's regulated together with the device it's part of, which means the regulatory review covers both the software and its hardware. Given that our software is designed to work specifically with the knee implant, it would be classified as SIMD.
That makes sense. So our regulatory approach needs to address the software as a component of the implant, not as a standalone product.
Precisely. We'll need to ensure that our documentation and testing cover how the software and the implant work together, focusing on their integration and interaction. This is crucial for meeting the regulatory requirements for SIMD. Does that help clarify our path forward?
Yes, it does. Thanks. It's clear now that our focus should be on integrating and thoroughly testing the software with the implant. I'll make sure our team aligns on this as we move forward. Thanks for the clarification, Colleen.
You're welcome.
If, for example, the implant itself had no embedded software, just sensors and electronics, but it interfaced with the patient monitoring app, would it then be SAMD?
That's an interesting scenario. The patient monitoring app might indeed be considered SAMD if it's submitted separately and performs functions that meet the definition of a medical device. Importantly, this classification doesn't change just because it interfaces with the implant.
So the app's classification as SAMD depends on its submission and function. What if the app and the implant were submitted together?
If the patient monitoring app is submitted as part of a system with the implant, it wouldn't be considered a separate SaMD. In this case, while the app isn't classified separately, the SaMD guidance from the FDA can still guide the testing and documentation required for the marketing submission.
I see. So the way we submit them affects their classification and the regulatory approach we need to take. Is that correct?
Exactly. The submission strategy can influence how each component is regulated. Understanding how separate and combined submissions work will help you decide the best approach for your device and any associated software. It's crucial to consider how each part interacts and the overall functionality it delivers to the patient.
Thanks for the earlier explanations. Looking ahead, how do the FDA's software requirements differ from the requirements for the implant itself?
That's a great question. Both the software and the implant need to comply with the FDA's quality system regulations initially. For the software specifically, there's a rigorous process of verification and validation. This ensures the software meets its intended design specification and functions as expected.
Verification and validation. Got it. What does that involve for the software?
For software, this often includes thorough testing to confirm if it performs well under all expected conditions. Plus, there's a need for clinical studies, usability testing, and gathering real-world data to back up any claims about its performance.
And what about managing risks?
Right. Risk management is crucial. For software, this means conducting detailed risk analysis to identify any potential hazards linked to the software, then implementing strategies to mitigate these risks. Also, you'll need to maintain comprehensive documentation throughout the software development lifecycle, or SDLC, and ensure robust cybersecurity measures are in place.
I see. And how does this compare to the implant's requirements?
The knee implant undergoes different types of testing, focusing mainly on its physical properties. It must pass extensive mechanical testing to evaluate wear resistance, fatigue strength, and its ability to bear loads. Biocompatibility testing is also essential to ensure the implant doesn't harm the body.
And what about the information provided to users?
The implant must come with a comprehensive labeling and instructions for use, or IFU, which include detailed surgical instructions and safety precautions. This is to ensure that everyone involved understands how to use and handle the implant safely.
That makes sense. It seems like there's a lot to consider for both components in terms of compliance and testing.
Absolutely. Each has its own specific challenges and requirements, but both aim to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the device. Understanding these requirements thoroughly will help you navigate the regulatory process more smoothly. Is there anything else you need clarification on?
No, that covers it for now. Thanks for breaking down the difference so clearly, Colleen. It really helps to understand the separate paths we need to take for the software and the implant. How do I determine the specific software requirements for our project, considering it's regulated as software in a medical device, SaMD, by the FDA?
Determining the requirements for SaMD involves a structured and detailed process to ensure you meet FDA regulations and the safety and effectiveness objectives of the medical device. Let's walk through the key steps. First, familiarize yourself with the relevant FDA regulations and guidance documents for your type of SaMD. This includes understanding the classification, risk categorization, and the regulatory pathway that applies.
Got it. I'll need to get a handle on what's in those documents. What comes next?
Next, you'll define the scope of your SaMD, including its intended use and functionality, and how it integrates with the medical device. It's crucial to document all software components that interact with or are part of the device.
So laying out everything the software needs to do and how it supports the device. How do you make sure we cover all bases?
You'll need to document user needs and the intended use thoroughly. Also, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential hazards related to the software. It's important to understand how software failures could affect patient safety. Also, don't forget about considering cybersecurity risks.
Risk assessment sounds critical. What about gathering the actual software requirements?
That involves collaboration with cross-functional teams, including clinicians, engineers, and regulatory experts. You need to gather and document detailed software requirements, making sure to cover performance expectations from all stakeholders.
And how do we keep track of all these requirements?
Establish traceability between user needs, design inputs, and outputs, along with testing. This helps ensure that each requirement is linked back to a user need and is addressed in the design and testing phases.
Traceability seems key. What about the requirements that deal specifically with functionality and safety?
Specify functional requirements clearly and unambiguously. Also, document safety requirements and risk mitigation strategies. Think about including fail-safe mechanisms and error handling procedures.
There's a lot to consider. What about validation and ongoing reviews?
Define rigorous testing and validation requirements and continuously review and refine your software requirements. Engage subject matter experts and stakeholders regularly to ensure the software meets all intended purposes as the project evolves.
Should we talk to the FDA during this process?
Yes, engaging with the FDA through pre-submission meetings can be very helpful. It allows you to discuss your regulatory strategy and specific requirements directly with the reviewers.
Sounds like we have some work ahead of us. What about when we're ready to submit?
Compile all relevant documentation, including the software requirements, risk assessments, and traceability matrices, to demonstrate compliance with the FDA's regulations. Consulting with regulatory experts who have experience in this area can also provide crucial guidance and insight.
This has been incredibly informative, Colleen. Thanks for outlining these steps so clearly. It gives us a solid roadmap to follow for our software development.
You're welcome, Stephen.